This is BBC News. I'm Karin Giannone. The headlines at 7, a huge rise in the number of people coming to settle in the UK as net migration hits 318,000, the highest level for a decade. The plight of Myanmar's migrants. We have the story of one young woman who's just been freed from people traffickers. 8 men appear in court over the Hatton Garden diamond heist. 2 of them are in their 70s. Also in the next hour, the Syrian city of Palmyra falls to Islamic State militants. There are fears for the UNESCO World Heritage Site as tens of thousands of people flee the fighting. Thomas Cook finally meets the parents of 2 children who died on one of its holidays in Corfu, offering them what it calls a financial gesture. And that's the spirit. Around 50 little ships cross the English Channel to mark the 75th anniversary of Dunkirk. Hello, good evening and welcome to BBC News. The government's aim of drastically reducing immigration suffered another setback today after new figures showed a surge in the numbers coming to Britain. Net migration, that's the number of people arriving in the UK minus the number leaving, has risen to 318,000. That's the highest level for a decade. The government says it remains committed to reducing the number to tens of thousands, and it's unveiled new measures aimed at tackling illegal immigration. James Landale has more details.
This is what the battle against illegal immigration looks like on the front line.
Immigration, can you come to the door, please?
A police raid on a house in West London where illegal immigrants were thought to be living. A raid for the cameras and the Prime Minister, whose bigger problem today was not migrants who come here illegally, but those who come fully within the law. The latest figures show that while 323,000 people left the UK last year, an extraordinary 641,000 came in, a massive increase from the year before. And of those, 290,000 came from outside the EU, 268,000 from within Europe. Figures that leave David Cameron's target of reducing net migration to the tens of thousands in tatters.
It's disappointing that we haven't made more progress, but I take these figures as a clear instruction to deliver and to deliver faster.
So today the Prime Minister gathered hundreds of civil servants at the Home Office to promise once again to cut net migration and set out new plans to stem the flow.
This isn't about simply having better border controls. It's about making sure that if people are here illegally, that it isn't as easy to use the health service, get a council house, have a job, have a driving licence. You've got to deal with each and every one of those things.
So he promised a new immigration bill in next week's Queen's speech, including new powers to seize the wages of illegal workers and deport them more quickly, a ban on firms recruiting overseas without advertising in the UK, and a plan to reduce significantly the number of skilled workers from outside the EU. And
changes to welfare to cut EU migration will be an absolute requirement in my renegotiation.
Isn't the truth that while the economy is growing, net migration is going to rise and no amount of clampdowns, deterrence, benefit curbs is going to change that?
Well, there is the approach of just give up, cave in and forget about it, but that is not my approach.
in recent years, Wrexham has seen some of the largest increases in Eastern European migration in Wales.
They just can't get jobs, the youngsters can't. I've no objection to them coming, but they need to be kept, don't they?
As long as they're coming here to work, it's all right, but I've met a lot that haven't come here to work, that's the trouble.
Maybe if you limited a bit and forced our own to work, then you wouldn't have as many people claiming benefits.
UKIP said the free movement of Labour from Europe had to be stopped. Labour said the Tories were copying their plans to protect low-paid migrants.
I respect the Prime Minister for picking our ideas. Good on him, because they're the right thing to do for the United Kingdom. I just wish he'd voted for them when we proposed them in the House of Commons a year ago.
David Cameron's hopes of reducing migration rest in part on persuading EU leaders to let him cut the benefits of their nationals when they come to this country. And that'll be no easy task, but it's one the Prime Minister will begin at an EU summit tomorrow. James Landale, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, with me now is Sundar Katwala, who's director of British Future, which describes itself as an independent, non-partisan think tank looking at people's hopes and fears on migration. Sundar Katwala, I mean, what do you make? What are your thoughts on what we heard today?
Well, clearly the figures are very, very high. Everybody's going to think that's a high level of immigration, a very high level of net migration at well over 300,000 now, and that's especially difficult for a government that has promised to get it down to the tens of thousands and didn't achieve that in the last parliament. And clearly it's going to start off with a very, very difficult job of getting the numbers anywhere near that, even over the next 5 years.
Why did this figure of getting it down to the tens of thousands, why is that still so far away? Is this because this primarily is made up of European Union migration, which doesn't fall within the illegal migration category?
No, that's right. I mean, people want immigration to be legal and managed well, and the Prime Minister sent some messages today about how illegal immigration is something he'll keep his eyes on, although it's already illegal to employ people who don't have legal status. EU migration is part of the picture, but here we see non-EU migration going up strongly as well. That's well over 100,000 net on its own. The government could control that, but doesn't. That's because a couple of 100,000 of these people are foreign students coming to pay fees to our universities, so that would be unpopular to cut that. So the government is also caught between people wanting lower numbers, but actually liking skilled migrants, liking students, and then having to decide, shall we stay in the European Union or not, because obviously free movement is part of the rules of the club.
Sundar Katwala, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Well, European leaders are gathering in the Latvian capital Riga for a summit that's supposed to focus on Ukraine and other countries beyond the EU's eastern borders, but it will also be the first time since his election victory that David Cameron has a chance to talk face-to-face with European colleagues. And as we've heard, he's said welfare changes to reduce migration will be an absolute requirement in his negotiations with the EU. Well, let's talk to our Europe correspondent, Chris Morris in Riga. And Chris, what sort of reception are we expecting for David Cameron, given what he wants to do?
I think it depends which bit of what he wants to do comes up first. If you're talking about, the idea of cracking down on the abuse of welfare systems, people moving to other countries simply to claim benefits, I've not heard a single European politician arguing that that wouldn't be a good idea to make sure that doesn't happen as much. But there are other things he's suggested which would run into a lot of opposition, particularly here in Eastern Europe, where a lot of people go abroad to work. For example, he's said that migrants should perhaps be denied access to benefit, even if they're working. So in-work benefits like tax credits for their first 4 years they're in the UK. Now, I've spoken to ministers from Latvia, the country we're in at the moment, from Slovakia. They're all saying the same thing. That's not acceptable. And the reason they say it's not acceptable is they say, look, Britain is one of the great supporters of the single market. But they have to understand from our perspective, the single market doesn't just mean the free movement of goods and services. It also means the free movement of people. It's part of the package. And that is something that other countries will push back very hard against if David Cameron tries to try and push it through.
Chris, this summit, as we said, was supposed to be focusing on Ukraine. How much has that been overshadowed?
I think that is still going to be the main issue, but other countries have been waiting for the British election. They know that there's been the possibility of a referendum looming. Well, now they know there is going to be one. And yes, it's important to talk about countries across the EU's eastern border, but frankly, over the long term, it's more important to talk about whether one of the biggest and most influential members of the Union is going to stay in or leave. So other countries are very keen to hear what exactly it is that David Cameron wants. Because when you ask other leaders, what do you make of David Cameron's plans for renegotiation, the answer is almost always the same. We're waiting to hear the details. And they expect to hear those details over the next few weeks, certainly by another summit in Brussels at the end of June. And when they know those exact details, that's when negotiation begins. And I think the British government knows, and it's going to have to sell this to those among the British people who are sceptical about all this. They're not going to get absolutely everything they want. It has to be a negotiation. In the EU, you always have to compromise on something. There's certainly an appetite for reform. A lot of people want to change the way the EU works, but every country, not just Britain, has its red lines that it won't cross.
Chris, thanks very much. Chris Morris in the Latvian capital, Riga. Now to the growing migrant crisis of Thailand, Malaysia and Indonesia, which has seen thousands of Rohingya Muslims who fled Myanmar stranded at sea. Officials in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, have said they'll attend a regional emergency meeting to tackle the problem. The BBC's Jonah Fisher reports now from western Myanmar, where he's been speaking to refugees who've been held for ransom by people traffickers.
They're emptying the boats off Myanmar's west coast, but the traffickers haven't given up on making some money. Haladar, a Rohingya Muslim, was ransomed and freed last weekend after 2.5 months stuck on a boat that never set out across the Andaman Sea.
The traffickers heard that their people in Thailand were on the run and being hunted by the police, so they decided to send us back to the brokers on the land.
She took us to the spot where the traffickers had brought her back on shore.
So 3 nights ago, just by those coconut trees over there, just by the sea, that's where Haladar was brought on shore by the traffickers with about 50 other people. Now, if you just look across 100 meters across to the left there, that building just there is a police checkpoint. Hello, hello, Miglava.
We went to ask if the police had seen anything.
We heard a trafficking boat landed here on Sunday night. We wondered if you had any information about it.
They told us they'd heard nothing. That Sunday night, Haladar's mother was contacted and immediately paid a ransom. But her close friend, Sanur, was not released.
My friend is owned by another trafficker from Malaysia, so when we were brought back on shore, they asked for $300 for her, and when the money couldn't be found, they took her away. I don't know where they've taken her now.
We went to see Sanur's mother. She told me she was desperately looking for her daughter and was so worried she was finding it hard to eat.
Do you want to go to the police? We can come with you to the police.
Of course, she said.
This woman has just come back from being trafficked, and this woman's daughter is still being held by the traffickers, but on land here, and we've come here to ask for your help.
The police said they couldn't take the report as there was a VIP visit in town and suggested the women come back on another day.
Today, too busy with the Vice President.
Very much on their own, Rakhine's Muslim community is pulling together. On Saturday, we watched as a businessman trying to negotiate the release of the husband of a Rohingya woman called Shafika. This week, we went back to find her.
So the traffickers were asking for $200 for Shafika's husband, and she was trying to borrow the money, but no one really knows whether the deal's gone through. Oh, hello.
The smile said it all.
Your husband's come back.
She told me he was in a clinic getting medical attention, but that he should be fine. It was a small piece of good news for a people persecuted at home and exploited wherever they go. Jonah Fisher, BBC News, in Rakhine State, Myanmar.
8 men charged in connection with the Hatton Garden jewellery raid in London have appeared in court today. They're aged between 48 and 76 and accused of conspiracy to burgle. Detectives say valuables worth more than £10 million were stolen. Our correspondent Sarah Campbell has more details.
The journey to court was as high profile as this case has become. A convoy of police vans transported the 8 suspects through London's streets. Photographers were keen to get a glimpse of the alleged burglars. Some of them were caught on camera inside the vans. But it was inside the courtroom as the men took their seats in the dock that the reason this case has remained in the headlines became clear. Reflecting their advancing years, most had greying or white hair. 2 seemed to have hearing issues, finding it difficult to hear the questions. The oldest was 76-year-old Brian Reeder from Dartford in Kent in the brown top. Next to him, 74-year-old John Collins. 3 of the group are of pensionable age. All are charged with conspiring to carry out a raid at this safety deposit company in London's jewellery district, Hatton Garden. It's believed the premises were entered via a lift shaft. A hole was then drilled through the 50-centimetre deep vault wall. And over the course of the bank holiday weekend, the contents of more than 70 deposit boxes were stolen. On Tuesday, the flying squad carried out a series of coordinated raids across London and Kent. Arrests were made, and the police said that they believed that items seized had been taken from the Hatton Garden safety deposit. In total, the police have arrested 10 men in connection with the raid. The 8 who appeared here earlier today were remanded in custody and are scheduled to appear at Southwark Crown Court on June the 4th. Sarah Campbell, BBC News, Westminster Magistrates Court.
There's growing concern about the fate of one of the world's most important archaeological sites. Fighters from so-called Islamic State have entered the ancient city of Palmyra in Syria, according to reports. The extremists have already destroyed sites in Iraq, and the fear is they'll do the same to Palmyra. So far, it's believed the site on the road between the capital, Damascus, and the eastern city of Deir ez-Zor is still intact. We asked the historian Dan Cruikshank to explain Palmyra's significance.
It is one of course, the great ruined classical cities from the ancient world. You travel from Damascus, say, going east, and you're in the desert. There's an oasis in the distance, and then suddenly you see a magical world, these great columns rising up, and you know you are in the presence of something utterly wonderful. Here is Colonnade Street, stretching from the west here to the east. Originally there would have been shops and palaces and houses each side of this. In the middle is this triumphal arch, a tetrapylon it's called, a wonderful piece of architecture. It is intrinsically beautiful, the stone in the desert landscape, the sun, the space, the sense of antiquity, and with a tremendous story attached to it as a great Arab trading city before Islam, one of the great jewels of the latter Roman Empire, really. That it should fall to Islamic State is appalling, given that we have seen what they did to Nimrud, Nineveh, and the other great classical Arab city, Hatra, in March. These attacks are cultural terrorism, they're political. They're destroying memory, they're destroying architecture, they're destroying archaeological sites, in addition to destroying images. This is why these attacks are kind of unprecedented. There are these great locations on Earth where the past somehow lives, and you can, through your imagination, go back, and it is, of course, full of information. If we lose Palmyra, we are robbing generations yet born of a place of wonder and inspiration.
That's the art historian Dan Cruikshank on the Syrian side of Palmyra and why it's considered one of the most important cultural centres of the ancient world. The headlines here on BBC News. A huge rise in the number of people coming to settle in the UK as net migration hits 318,000. That's the highest figure for a decade. Officials in Myanmar say they will go to an emergency meeting in Thailand next week to address the region's growing migrant crisis. And as we were hearing, the Syrian city of Palmyra falls to Islamic State militants. There are fears for the UNESCO World Heritage Site as tens of thousands of people flee the fighting. The former England footballer Paul Gascoigne and the actress Sadie Frost are among a number of celebrities who've received six-figure settlements after their phones were hacked by journalists at Mirror Group newspapers. The total figure for damages was in excess of £1 million. Our correspondent, David Sillito, was in court.
Sadie Frost arrived in court today for judgment on 5 years of torment. Her medical records, her children's lives, her mental health, visits to Alcoholics Anonymous all appeared in the Mirror. She thought it was her friends who were betraying her.
When you lose trust in your friends, your family, you begin to, it's a very lonely place to be.
These are record payouts. Paul Gascoigne was hacked for 9 years. He's receiving more than £188,000. Coronation Street, Shobna Gulati, over £117,000. Sadie Frost, more than £260,000. And EastEnders Lucy Benjamin, £157,000.
7 years the hacking took place, and I'm just glad it's all over.
And for years, Mirror Group denied there was any evidence of hacking.
But what's emerged here is the fact that the Mirror was hacking phones on a daily basis. And it wasn't just intercepting voicemail messages. It was accessing confidential details, medical records, and this was going on for more than 10 years.
Emails were written in code. The Muppets were the hackers. One journalist was making 60 to 100 calls a day. What's uncertain is how many claims will now come. Scores, certainly, possibly hundreds. This is a legal landmark. The question is, how far has the culture changed?
Now, phone hacking is hopefully history. What is going to be replaced? The competition is still there. Journalists are still under severe pressure to go out to get that scoop. And the question is, can they and will they all do it within the law?
As the victims left, Mirror Group was pondering an appeal. It thought £12 million would cover the costs. That figure went up today by an extra £16 million. And criminal charges are also being considered. David Solito, BBC News.
Thomas Cook says it's donating an unspecified sum to the families of 2 children who died of carbon monoxide poisoning while on one of its holidays in Corfu. The announcement was made after the company's chief executive gave a face-to-face apology to the parents of Christy and Bobby Shepherd, following mounting criticism of Thomas Cook's conduct. It's also been revealed that 2 hotel staff convicted over the deaths have been found working at other hotels which the company uses. Danny Savage reports.
In a lawyer's office in central London today, the parents of Bobby and Christy Shepherd arrived for a meeting they've waited nearly 9 years for. To hear from the boss of Thomas Cook, who arrived keen to make a sincere apology after years of getting it wrong.
I'm very grateful that the family agreed to meet me. Thank you very much.
And do you mean it, or is this just to put to the public?
I mean what I say. I mean what I say. I'm very grateful.
They gathered to discuss the tragic deaths of a brother and sister who were supposed to be on a fun half-term holiday in Corfu. Instead, they were poisoned by fumes from a hotel boiler and were brought home in coffins. An inquest concluded Thomas Cook breached its duty of care. So what was made of the apology offered today?
For the first time in this tragedy, Thomas Cook have done the right thing. They listened to the heartbreaking accounts from my clients and heard how their company effectively destroyed their lives.
Nothing can give us back our children or the carefree lives we once led. No one can erase the lifelong pain for Christy and Bobby's family and friends. We cannot change the past, and we accept that it may be time to look to the future.
The family also called for the bungalow where they died to be demolished and replaced with a playground. But after today's apology and a pledge from Thomas Cook to make large donations to several charities, the family of these 2 children feel that some good has finally come from this sad saga. Danny Savage, BBC News, Central London.
Some of the other stories making BBC News. On Friday, the Republic of Ireland will be the first country in the world to hold a referendum on whether to legalise same-sex marriage. The vote to extend marriage rights to same-sex couples has divided the traditionally conservative country. If passed, Ireland will be the first country to adopt same-sex marriage through a popular vote. The Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall have visited St Patrick's Catholic Church in North Belfast, which has been at the centre of bitter marching disputes between Protestants and Catholics. They also shook hands with Northern Ireland's First Minister Peter Robinson and Deputy First Minister Martin McGuinness. Now, a flotilla of ships has set out from the south coast for France to mark the 75th anniversary of the Dunkirk evacuation. It was one of World War II's most important operations in which more than 300,000 Allied troops were rescued and which led to the phrase, the Dunkirk spirit. Andy Moore reports.
A Hurricane and a Spitfire flew by in tribute to the little ships as they headed out to sea. There were all sorts of different vessels, from Thames barges to pleasure cruisers. Many of these little ships were designed to sail on inland waters, so setting out across the channel on the open seas will be quite a challenge, but they'll be well looked after. This time they were escorted by a lifeboat. 75 years ago, they were attacked by German warplanes.
Hour after hour, men wade out to the waiting ships.
The British and French forces were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, surrounded by the Germans. Hundreds of small boats were requisitioned at short notice. Their job was to ferry the soldiers to larger ships or to bring them directly to English ports. 95-year-old Garth Wright remembers the relief of being told he was going home.
The skipper of the Codrington, the captain, said, all right, you can stay on board. What a lovely feeling, and I didn't argue with him at all.
Vic Viner was 23 at the time. He manned a small boat, rowing soldiers off the beaches in rough seas.
There was blood all over my hands, and so was my colleagues, and we looked and we'd sweated blood to the effort because the surf was running. So I went back aboard and said to the captain, you know, we can't do this anymore. He said, well, you're not going to, because an Operation Dynamo has taken place.
And for the men on board the damaged ship...
In the end, more than 1/3 men were rescued from the beaches. They formed the nucleus of an army that would live to fight another day. The slow journey to France would take 6 or 7 hours, but the seas are calm, just as they were 75 years ago, when Operation Dynamo ended in what Winston Churchill called a miracle of deliverance. Andy Moore, BBC News, Ramsgate.
Now you're watching BBC News with me, Karin Giannone, here in London. Goodbye to all our viewers on BBC World News and BBC4. Coverage continues here on the News Channel in the UK.